and there's a good number of MSPs, and I'm friendly with many of them that do have those right ethics. I think there's a number of bad actors, very large actors, that seem to do things incorrectly, in my opinion.
I'm sure I recall, I think they still do this, but when it wasn't that long ago, when if you wanted to cancel your cable subscription or your any type of utility, and when you went through that initial process, they would do something which was quite crafty, and they would have a whole department designed to stop you from leaving.
Subscription
Do you remember
retention,
these?
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like that's maybe what's going on here, is that they are using a number of different tactics, including contractual clauses that financially penalize the severance of the relationship. Joining me today on the MSP Zone is Mr. Neil Holme, Chief Executive Officer and founder of Impact Business Technology, an MSP Verify and SOC 2 audited managed service provider based in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. Originally from the United Kingdom, Neil holds a degree in electrical engineering from the University of Salford. After working internationally in power systems, he moved to the US in 1996 and launched Impact in 2001 to support small and medium-sized businesses with enterprise-grade IT services. Neil, did I get that right?
Is that on my website?
That's in your secret dossier that we have on you.
That's why in my file. Got it.
It also mentioned philanthropist, adventure, and several other things, but I didn't feel that was pertinent to what we were talking about today.
I had AI write that.
Yeah. So we have been talking one-on-one and in other groups, the Inspire group that you're a member of, and this has come up in outside of that community as well. So I know it's a known issue. I don't know how much people know about it or talk about it, because I sense that this is not the type of thing you would go to a conference and hear about, at least from the public speakers. But it is the question of contracts between managed service providers and their customers, and the way these agreements are being used, not for the first time, but certainly there seems to be perhaps an increase in their usage to really restrict customers who are unhappy with service and want to go elsewhere, but are prohibited from doing so in a number of ways. We're not talking about they're unable to stop the contract, but there are reasons in the agreement that make it just very, very difficult and painful almost. Before we get into this, could you give us just a quick update for those of you not familiar, those out there not familiar with Impact? What is it that you and your awesome team do every day?
So we are a managed IT service provider. We're a blended MSP, MSSP. We believe you can't be a good MSP without thinking about security. You can't be a good MSSP without thinking about management and monitoring of your system. So the two things are inextricably linked together. We're based in Connecticut. We have a cluster of customers in the private equity and financial services space, which is kind of where we've carved out a niche and a specialty for ourselves, which is sort of, it ties in somewhat with the topic today in terms of the driving forces perhaps behind some of these contractual changes. And that was one of the topics you wanted to bring up.
So your customers, not exclusively private equity companies, correct? Just the dominant.
Yeah. So one of the paths we take is we also serve the portfolio companies that some of our private equity companies hold. So our actual customer base is very diverse, but it is fed through and seeded by private equity. Certainly in Connecticut, there's a very strong private equity market.
Indeed. I think let's set the tone. It is not unusual. In fact, it has been a decades-long practice in the MSP profession to have agreements and have sections of the agreements to deal with the eventual termination of the relationship and how both parties will leave. And let's be fair. We all know that there are plenty of scenarios where the MSP wants to get out of a relationship with a customer. So we are not talking about issues like that where I'm assuming you don't have any problem with the existing status of agreements and how they're structured in terms of letting an MSP out with certain things happening, right? It's not
Yeah,
like
I
you're
mean,
just going to call them up on a Friday afternoon and say, you're done, find someone else by Monday morning. And, we're not talking about that.
no, there should be a mutual separation agreement that takes into account both sides' requirements. So for 25 years, we've operated on month-to-month agreements, and it's worked very well for us. We're doing just fine. But over the past, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of M&A activity in the MSP space. Everyone out there starts yelling, "Oh, you must have 3-year term agreements that affects your enterprise value." And I tend to disagree quite strongly on these parts, simply because I've had hundreds of customers over the years. My first customer ever is still my customer. My first employee is still an employee, and we do much better on relationships and doing the right thing for the customer than any contract could ever put into words. I tend to think that if a customer relationship has gone sour, either you know because the customers changed their mind or because the MSP no longer feels they're a good fit, a piece of paper should not be a hurdle to doing the right thing.
That's interesting because I would say that we have seen an ebb and flow, and we are coming back. Maybe a pendulum swing is maybe the more appropriate term. But I remember in the very early days when Impact was started, you at the tail end or the after the cliff of the .com fall when you guys started, and not that around the same time that MSP Line started. In fact, multi-year agreements were all the rage, right? It was the reason that you had a managed services sales team out there, making all this money, was to sell multi-year agreements, 3, 5. I remember 10-year agreements were like very realistic objectives within the enterprise, MSP sales space, and that carried down to the SMB, and then it shifted mid 2000s into month to month, as you said. I don't think that I agree with you, Neil. I don't think that it's the term of the agreement. I think it is the duration of the relationship that translates to the value. 100%. Yeah. I have a follow-up question. In your agreement, in ideal situation, and I know your attorneys, they're very fine people, so I don't want, I'm trying to tread lightly here. Do you see that there's a distinction between your normal month-to-month managed services agreement, the services Impact delivers, the price the customers pay to you, and entering into a relationship zone, let's call it an offboarding, where one party, either you as the MSP or the customer, wants to separate, that there would be a different relationship. Financially, they're going to pay something different. You're going to have to do different things. Do you agree with that premise or no?
I do, and a termination clause should, again, it should benefit both sides. It should be mutually beneficial, whereby we will be reimbursed for our real termination costs, but the customer can leave. There are some very valid reasons for having multi-year agreements. If you have negotiated a discounted price, if you have a lot of upfront costs that are going to be amortized across the contract, that's fine. In those cases, the termination clause should effectively outline, if you terminate early, here will be the costs that we have built into the contract. But what we've seen in a few cases recently is this termination clause is being used as a cudgel to artificially inflate and scare the customer into renewing rather than leaving. And that to me is what I find objectionable. It's not reflective of the type of industry that I associate myself with. And it's short-term money grabbing.
Okay. I want to get into specifics if we can, because I think you have some that you might be willing to share, at least in the abstract. But just to be clear, and maybe playing devil's advocate for those out there, maybe less mature MSPs or customers who've never really experienced this or want to know more, what might be a legitimate offboarding cost where a customer says, or an MSP may just not have a clue of, there could be reasonable things that don't just involve shutting off the lights of whatever services the customer was receiving. Could you walk through some of those scenarios for us?
Yeah, so offboarding costs could quite easily take the form of Microsoft licensing. So Microsoft hold us to a 1-year term. That renewal is maybe separate from our managed services contract renewal, whereby, if they say they want to leave in June, but their licenses run through the end of November, there's an offboarding cost to prepay for those licenses.
To make you the MSP whole for that obligation you
Yes,
have to Microsoft.
because Microsoft holds me responsible for those. We can get into a whole other podcast about Microsoft NCE. It's not, but that's one possibility. Another is perhaps where we have done an upfront project that was valued at $5,000. We are 7 months into a 12-month amortization of that we said we'll take care of it. Fine. They've got to pay for those remaining 5 months now because they didn't satisfy that amortization. So there are a few instances. We host servers in our data center, and if they want to take those servers elsewhere, there is a migration cost, a data egress cost, or some hours for me to shut these down and copy them somewhere. But those are small things. When it comes to what we've seen in the past where migration costs are being listed as exorbitant, that's when it is being weaponized and is used as a scare tactic to keep the customer attached.
Understood. But at a baseline level, what I'm hearing you say is that the offboarding process, even a normal average, let's call it offboarding procedure, is not going to be the same as your month-to-month managed services, meaning the customer is incorrect in saying, but I'm paying you every month, so I expect you to do these offboarding things as part of what I pay you for the managed services. You're setting out a very clear example that is absolutely not the case.
That is absolutely not the case. And your agreements should specify this. If they're silent on it, you leave yourself open to some sort of problem. You don't need to specify every dollar amount, but certainly you need to let people know that a project is a project and is not covered by your agreement.
Wonder if you have a guess. I have my own guess of what percentage of the MSP market out there, or companies proclaiming themselves MSPs, are silent, have agreements that are silent on that issue of what is an offboarding project and what is to be considered that type of relationship phase.
I think I can recommend someone that probably has that info.
Yeah. So in fairness, there may be a lot of customers, a lot of end users who have only ever experienced a quote unquote MSP who never differentiated between managed services month to month versus an onboarding or offboarding, and may have just assumed that was just all the same thing when it's not.
Yeah. I mean, so there is this concept of, like I say, I've had customers for 10, 15 years, and then a business event happens and we need to part ways. Just last month, long-term customer of ours, they got acquired. They got acquired by a much larger organization. These services are going to get rolled up. I have nothing to say here. Goodbye, good luck, and how can we help with the migration? I don't want to burn any bridges. You never know where those partners are going to go once their non-compete runs out. And so do the right thing. You help them along their way, but the contract is over. I don't need to eke out another 18 months of a 3-year agreement for something that I'm not actually going to do.
Understood. And I think that's a fair outlook, but it's also fair for that customer to look at the MSP that they're leaving will have some things that are unusual costs that are not managed services costs, and therefore must be treated separately, like the Microsoft licensing I think you brought up, the server hosting, transfer of, just the time of transferring credentials. Doing it safely, I would think is a incredibly important and potentially time involved step.
Not as difficult as you think. I got to be honest. If you
selling
manage
it
your
too
MSP well, you've got this under control. We do it all the time. In fact, for one of my customers, we give him an entire encrypted copy of his documentation every month. That's part of his safeguard. If he, if we get hit by a bomb and we all disappear, he's got everything he needs. It's fine. He can have it. It's his data.
I like that. I
And
like
it
that.
takes me 5 minutes a month to download a PDF, encrypt it with 7-zip, and send it off to him. So it's really not technically challenging to do this. You just got to be willing to do it.
Willing to do it, but also there are legitimate scenarios where I've seen them where, depending on the sophistication of the new entity, either a new provider or a new internal IT department, that may or may not have the same tools that the outgoing MSP has. I've seen a lot where, to a competent new IT administrator, it should be simple, but in these scenarios where they end up in, unfortunately, litigation, it's not as simple as what you presented. Not because you're wrong, just because they were less mature than you would have been. Okay, so now we've set forth that there's a legitimate need for different treatment for offboarding as well as onboarding. I mean, I've seen MSPs who have an onboarding process, and sometimes they treat it completely separate from their managed services structure. How is this being weaponized? What are some of the things that you've started to see recently that concern you?
So, without naming names, of course, we went through a prospecting process recently with a small private equity firm. They are at the tail end of their third fund, going into a dormant period before they decide if they want to raise fund 4 and start all this over again. They were much larger. They've downscaled to about 3 or 4 people, but they were still on a very large infrastructure hosted by their incumbent MSP. And we proposed a very light contract because that's all they needed, a migration to fully cloud-based, no more infrastructure. And in fact, we were going to be responsible for all of the migration costs. That was baked into the contract with an upfront project. The customer went silent on me, and after several follow-ups, he told us that his incumbent MSP had told him it would be very expensive to migrate away from their platform. They were going to incur very large charges for data egress or migration of data, and it was going to be cheaper for him to stay with them than it would be to migrate away. So now he is still left with a legacy hosted server infrastructure on a new 4-year contract, albeit at a reduced price, so he did get something out of it, rather than migrating away totally to a modern, nimble, appropriate structure. And being the customer, he is not tech savvy. This is why he has an MSP. And I think he was fed untruths, and he was fed information that was in favor of the incumbent MSP rather than what was right for the customer.
To the extent that you're willing to share this, do you think that the customer knew? Obviously, the customer was talking to you. Therefore, there was just testing the market, dipping his toes in, whatever. He just wanted to see what the rest of the world looked like. Do you think that he understood that there was a difference between what you were offering and his incumbent MSP was offering?
I think so, but he's probably not fully aware of what is best for him. He'll listen to whoever's talking the loudest. And frankly, my belief is that he's best in the cloud, and the incumbent MSP's belief is he is best in their data center. I don't know what the truth is. My feeling is he was led down the wrong path because that is what is financially advantageous to the incumbent MSP.
I think there's an economic principle somewhere. Maybe it's called sunk investment or sunken costs.
Yes.
And this sounds like this is more of a you're going to get burned financially doing this, not we are a superior MSP and therefore you ought to stay. Like that seems to be missing here. The value of the MSP, not the financial penalty that the customer is going to receive.
That's how it was portrayed to me by my prospective customer. And so he made
so
what
the
he
customer
felt was
saw that.
Yeah, he made what he felt was the easier decision to stay. That's what I find painful. That is, I want to make sure that the MSP industry isn't perceived this way. because that's not good for our image.
I agree. I mean, other professions certainly do take steps to deal with these types of issues. I wouldn't be told by a physician, well, you can't go to another doctor because it's going to be cost prohibitive of you to do so. I mean, that would smack of all sorts of impropriety and wrong-headed thinking, regardless of.
There's something called ethics here, and they are governed by an ethical responsibility to do the right thing for their patient. And there's a good number of MSPs, and I'm friendly with many of them that do have those right ethics. I think there's a number of bad actors, very large actors, that seem to do things incorrectly, in my opinion.
You mentioned something there I'd like to examine a bit more. A very old recurring theme, and I'm going to be very cautious because we have 30,000 members in the MSP Alliance. There's quite a few of them that are quite large. So I am not stating this as an absolute truth, but you mentioned that you're seeing this perhaps with larger service providers. And if I may infer some things that might also be that they've grown, either organically or maybe they've been cobbled together through acquisition. Do you believe that the larger providers are more inclined to have these types of clauses just because it's maybe they have a more sophisticated legal team or finance team, and therefore they are using more these types of tactics to retain customers? Is that a reasonable assumption or not?
I think that is reasonable. I've got no way to measure its accuracy. I think also a good number of these are operated by professional sales teams, where the salespeople are compensated on customer retention or customer re-signups, and the incentives are perhaps pushing the wrong kind of behavior.
I'm sure I recall, I think they still do this, but when it wasn't that long ago, when if you wanted to cancel your cable subscription or your any type of utility, and when you went through that initial process, they would do something which was quite crafty, and they would have a whole department designed to stop you from leaving.
Subscription
Do you
retention.
remember these?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like that's maybe what's going on here, is that they are using a number of different tactics, including contractual clauses that financially penalize the severance of the relationship.
Well, so the FTC just issued a ruling on this, the click to cancel ruling. If it's a one-click sign up for your subscription, it should be a one-click cancellation for your subscription. So yeah, there is some momentum in industry for this. It shouldn't take legislation for us to do the right thing for our customers,
Yeah. And just to be clear, we are not, I don't think you are suggesting that MSPs behave like Netflix, where anybody can sign up and then 2 months later they could just cancel their Netflix subscription or their HBO subscription. We're not talking about that type of simplicity.
It is incredibly hard to onboard a new customer. It takes a lot of work, which is one of those reasons to sign them up for a term contract. It's going to take you 3 to 6 months to fully get everything for that customer working in your standards and your image, and you want a payback for that. But to artificially extend the life of that contract just because it makes no sense to me that you're holding a customer hostage where both of you want to leave, but the paper says no. Paper says you're going to pay me 100% of the remainder of the contract.
Which is fundamentally different than what we talked about earlier, which is a reasonable offboarding of necessary steps needed to sever the relationship safely. Because there's an element here which is safety and security and availability of the customer environment during an offboarding session that isn't just as simple as, hey, I want to leave and I'm going to pay my last invoice on time and that's it. If there's onboarding costs, as you just said, then there's going to be offboarding costs. So I agree with that.
So what's ironic though is the cost for me to acquire that customer, I would have borne his offboarding costs. The losing MSP would not have. I would have done all the work to migrate his data. The incumbent MSP just had to give me a password.
Yes. Do
It's not
you
quite that
believe
simple,
that?
but that's the picture.
I get your point. Do you believe that this is a sales technique that you would agree with, or perhaps you're already using to advise potential customers? This is how we're going to handle the onboarding. This is how the relationship will last. Should the relationship stop, this is how we're going to handle this. Do you believe that that should be discussed at the beginning of the relationship so that there's no ambiguity about what happens?
Yeah, we're pretty upfront with this. If we know it is going to be a difficult onboarding process, we will quote them an onboarding project. And that is paid, or it is agreed to be amortized, and then there is a term to the contract. And after that, we've satisfied all of our onboarding costs, and the customer is happy. They've gotten the change in technology and service that they were looking for, and now we're on a month-to-month contract.
And then because the environment could change. I mean, especially if you're talking about a long-term relationship like you have and many other MSPs have. If you have a 5, 10, 15-year relationship with a customer, the IT environment that you went into might look quite different. And if the relationship ends, their needs to offboard could look very different than the onboarding project that you started with. True?
Indeed, yeah, because all kinds of things have changed along the way. But I don't think you can predict that at the beginning of an engagement. If you think 3 years ago, could you have predicted where we were with AI right now? If you say yes, I'd call you a liar. Business moves extraordinarily quickly. The pace of change is increasing all the time. You can't possibly predict what things will look like in the mid future. So just be flexible. And if at some point during your relationship everything changes, we say, fine, let's move all the servers from your own office into our data center, then obviously there would be a difference in the potential offboarding costs later. And that should all be discussed when you're talking about that project.
You are many things, not a lawyer yet, I'm assuming.
Never going to be.
No intention to become one. But I'm assuming that you would be accepting of a general and quite nimble and small paragraph in your agreement that simply says, should there be an offboarding event, it will be treated this way. And you, without coming up with a dollar amount at the beginning of the relationship, you could simply say the cost will be billed at this, like an hourly rate or a predetermined project, right? But basically, it's not going to be treated as a managed services thing. And here's how we're going to arrive at the cost of that event, because that event could look very different for every customer. Do you think that that would be an acceptable agreement
Yeah,
to have?
absolutely. Yeah, and then there is an expectation and a negotiation. What is reasonable at that point? Well, that's to be negotiated.
Yeah. And yes, and yeah. And if it's not negotiated, then at least if they say to you, Neil, I want you to do these 100 things, and you say, well, okay, then I'm just going
Here's
to,
the price.
you don't want to agree to the cost, then I'm going to bill you at an hourly cost, and that's that. And yeah, I don't know that there's any other prophylactic measure other than education and awareness to drive this to first the MSPs, to keep them from adopting this behavior, and certainly to educate and make aware the customers that this is not a best practice in our profession, and that they ought to really negotiate against those types of punitive escape clauses. Is there anything else that you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, it's you must read the fine print, but I have to admit, my managed services agreement and all of the addendums and attachments and all of the things we have to cover, it's about 60 pages. In my life, I think I've had 2 customers that actually read the whole thing. And came back with some great constructive criticism, and we've made adjustments since. But no, it's very difficult. We work in an extraordinarily complex environment with data, regulation, litigation, responsibilities, extraordinarily broad technology footprint that we have to cover. Our contracts are necessarily long and complex, but part of the relationship should be the discussion of these things. Sure, the words are in the contract, and if you want to go find them, they're in there and it's spelled out. But this is part of a relationship, not part of a legal negotiation.
Yeah. I must end the conversation with one topic that I know we've talked about recently, that a number of MSPs are starting to talk about, and it was just brought to my attention a number of weeks ago, and that is this notion that an MSP could sell a customer contract. So sell a contract with a managed services customer on an open exchange, not a securities transaction here, just to be clear. Well, at least it could be, I suppose, but I'm not contemplating it in a public security fashion, but I'm talking about just a private contract between an MSP and customer. What are your thoughts about this type of behavior? Is this good for the MSP profession or not good?
I think it's good for salespeople. I think it is terrible for the customer.
Why good for salespeople?
Well, because they can sell and they don't have to do. That's great. It's like selling a mortgage. You go off, you sell a mortgage, and then the mortgage gets sold off to one of the big services. There's no money changing hands. You just get your commission and off you go. That's, sure, it's a business and it happens in lots of businesses. Car leases, the dealership sells the car, but somebody else handles the lease. It's sold off and you get a commission. I think certainly with MSP, certainly where there is a in-person and a support and a close relationship with the customer, you can't sell that.
Yeah.
If I bought a contract from somebody else, that customer doesn't know me from Adam. All of my contracts say, this can't be assigned without, mutual agreement. So I don't quite understand how this is going to be a successful business. I wouldn't want to buy one of those because we don't know each other. We've not gone through that discovery process.
And well, to your point, I think you just brought up a very probable reality, which is these are probably immature providers. They may or may not be MSPs. I mean, we don't know. The platform is being billed as a platform for MSPs, but I would agree that they're probably getting into a lot of legal hot water at some point. Why would you want to buy that anyway? Why would you want to sell it? Much less, why would you want to buy that type of a contract without knowing who the customer is?
Maybe they're very good at sales. Maybe they landed a whale and their boat's not big enough. I can see some reasons why this is attractive to some MSPs, but I don't think it's in the best interest of the customer. And the customers should be looking for assignment clauses or the absence, perhaps, of assignment clauses in the agreements.
Something tells me that if I was an MSP and I signed that hypothetical whale that you speak of, and I had concerns after the closing that I could service the client adequately, that I would be better off coming to you, a friend, a colleague, and say, Neil, could we work something out and introduce the customer in this and make sure that there's a transfer happens with their involvement. There's something surreptitious and clandestine about putting them onto an exchange. I'm assuming they have no idea. That's the thing that gets me is that.
That's what I'm concerned about, that all of a sudden this 3-year contract with limited exit clauses has just been sold. Or factored for that matter.
Education and awareness, right? Maybe we just have to do more of that as an industry and get the word out.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, Neil, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts and insights. This is I think we need to keep a tab on this as a general issue, because I would hate to think for any customer listening to this out there, or any policy or legislative people out there, this is not what our industry's best practice is. It would be to have an agreement that protects the MSP and the customer during a transfer period and does it safely. And that is one of the chief areas of contention, and it need not be if you have already planned this out in advance and have it documented in your agreement.
Indeed.
Nothing more to say about it than that.
Sounds good.
Neil?
Charles, happy Friday.
Pleasure. You too. Until next time.
See you soon.